So now to the latest on the mysterious death of Nolan Wells. For the first time since Wells' body was found, we're hearing from a friend of the 18-year-old who was with him on the day that he died. Tristan Shepard, who says that he was with Wells on the 4th of July, but declined to speak on camera because of the threats that he says he's been receiving.
An 18-year-old boy leaves his phone behind on a boat. That single detail, small, almost forgettable, has become one of the most contested facts in a case that has now reached a grand jury, a judge under police protection, and 3 criminal defendants charged with making threats. Because Nolan Wells was supposed to be staying on an island, people who stay on islands usually keep their phones. He didn't have his, and 6 weeks later, nobody, not the county, not the state, not the independent pathologist his family paid to find answers, has been able to say for certain how he died. This is what's actually known. This is what's alleged, and this is what still, after everything, remains unanswered. July 4th, 2026, Horn Island, Mississippi, an 11-mile strip of uninhabited barrier land off the Gulf Coast, reachable only by boat. No roads, no cell towers, just sand, tide pools, and, on a holiday weekend, roughly 200 people who'd made the same trip Nolan Wells had. He wasn't a stranger to it. His family says he'd been to Horn Island before, more than once, with the same group of friends. The night before, he'd made his mother salmon for dinner. Then he left to spend the night at a friend's house ahead of the holiday. His mother, Christine Wells Wansley, remembers it as nothing, a hug, a kiss, and he was gone. By morning, he was on a boat heading for the island. The boat left the mainland at 9:56 a.m. He was last seen around 3 p.m., in blue swim trunks, sunglasses, talking with a girl he'd met that day. His friends got back on the boat. Nolan didn't. Why didn't he go with them? According to people who were there, he chose to stay, to keep talking to someone he'd just met, with plans to find his own way back later. If that's true, why did he leave his phone with the group that was leaving? That's the detail his family keeps returning to, not because it proves anything on its own, but because it's the first thread that doesn't quite hold when you pull on it. He never made it back. His mother reported him missing that night.
Please report her 18-year-old son, Nolan Wells, missing last seen at 3 on Horn Island.
What followed was one of the largest search efforts the Mississippi Gulf Coast had seen in years. The Jackson County Sheriff's Office, the U.S. Coast Guard, the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources, Gulf Islands National Seashore Rangers, a Civil Air Patrol plane, a county helicopter, dozens of private boats, including one carrying Nolan's parents and his former high school football coach, who'd joined the search themselves. For 2 days, they searched the water and the shoreline. They found nothing. Then, on the morning of July 6th, just before 8:45 a.m., a National Park Service ranger found a body on the northwestern tip of the island. Sheriff John Ledbetter wouldn't confirm the identity publicly right away, but he acknowledged it matched Nolan's description. That afternoon, his mother posted on Facebook. She'd gotten the call. It was her son. The following day, the Jackson County coroner said dental records had confirmed it. An autopsy was scheduled. DNA results were still pending. And within roughly an hour of the body being recovered, before any autopsy had actually been performed, investigators had already told the family what they believed had happened. Drowning. No foul play suspected. How can an official cause of death be suggested before an autopsy is even done? It wasn't presented as a final ruling. Investigators have since said it reflected an early working theory based on the circumstances. A body found in the water, wearing only swim trunks, in a spot consistent with someone who'd gone in without coming back out. If it was only a working theory, why did it take the family more than a month and an independent autopsy to get anyone to walk it back? Before any of this, Nolan Wells was just a kid from Ocean Springs who signed with Southwest Mississippi Community College on National Signing Day, February 2025. 3 of his own high school teammates signing alongside him. He called it a blessing, but when reporters asked him about it, he barely talked about himself. He talked about his friends and what it meant that they were all doing this together. His high school coach, Jake Bramlett, said afterward that Nolan carried himself with humility, that he treated everyone with respect, that he worked hard and led by example, the kind of player and the kind of person every coach hopes to get. His mother describes him as quiet, protective, full of corny jokes that made people laugh whether they wanted to or not. His father says he was the funniest person in their family, that his younger siblings are still struggling to understand that he's gone. There's a story his parents tell about an argument they were having years ago, before any of this, how Nolan, still a toddler, ran into the room in his diaper and started dancing until they were both laughing instead of fighting. That's the person his family wants people to remember, not a headline, not a mystery. A son who made peace in a room just by walking into it. His funeral was held July 20th. His mother didn't want it to be only grief. She called it a homegoing celebration, a party, she said, because that's what Nolan would have wanted, instead of everyone sitting around crying. Filmmaker Tyler Perry paid for the service. Colin Kaepernick helped fund the independent autopsy that was still to come. A GoFundMe for the family passed $200,000 within weeks. None of that brings him back. All of it is what's left of a life that was supposed to have decades still ahead of it. Days after Nolan's body was found, his family retained civil rights attorney Ben Crump. Crump's position, from the beginning, was simple. Too many things about this case didn't add up. Why would someone planning to stay behind leave his phone with the group leaving without him? Why, with roughly 200 people on that island, did nobody see him struggling in the water, or drowning at all? And why did witness accounts conflict, some describing Nolan as planning to leave with his friends, others telling the sheriff's office he'd chosen to stay? These aren't accusations, they're gaps. And gaps, in a case like this, tend to get filled with something, either answers or speculation. For weeks, it was mostly the second one. With funding help from Kaepernick, the family commissioned a second, independent autopsy, performed by Dr. Roger A. Mitchell Jr., a credentialed forensic pathologist with experience on other high-profile cases. On July 22nd, at the Knox National Convention in Chicago, Crump stood in front of cameras and read from Mitchell's report. The findings were not what anyone wanted to hear, in either direction. The cause and manner of death, undetermined. Crump read directly from the pathologist's language, that he could not rule out whether non-accidental factors had contributed to or caused Nolan's death. He also could not rule out drowning. It was inconclusive. Genuinely, both ways. But there was one physical finding in the report that stood out. Red discoloration in the soft tissue at the back of Nolan's head. But what does that discoloration mean? Nobody can say for certain. Dr. Mitchell's report noted the most significant limitation of his exam. By the time he examined the body, the state medical examiner had already removed tissue from the airway, lungs, and stomach during the first autopsy, which meant Mitchell couldn't check for water in the lungs or confirm what, if anything, had been swallowed. That's described as common practice in these situations, not evidence of concealment, but it meant Mitchell was working with an incomplete picture from the start. So what was the discoloration? An injury, or nothing more than decomposition? Forensic pathologist Dr. Judy Melinek, who has not examined Nolan's body, has not been retained by either side, and has issued no report of her own, offered general context on this point in media interviews.
Being able to definitively state the cause of death after a body has not been found for several days and has been subsequently autopsied twice with signs of decomposition is incredibly unlikely. Drowning is what's called a diagnosis of exclusion, which means that when you've got a fresh body, you want to be able to look at the body and see if there's any other causes of death for that body that is found in water that exclude the death being exclusively a drowning.
Noted that discoloration in a body that's been in the water and begun to decompose can be a completely normal consequence of decomposition, not necessarily a sign of trauma. She also pointed out something telling. The fact that the pathologist didn't call it definitive trauma outright may itself be a signal of how uncertain that finding really is. That's an important distinction, because a claim spread online in the weeks that followed, that Dr. Melinek had personally concluded Nolan died by manual strangulation. She didn't. Multiple news outlets had to publicly correct that claim. What she actually said was narrower and more careful, that the evidence has real limitations, and that nobody should treat an ambiguous finding as a confirmed one, in either direction. A full toxicology report was expected as part of the state's investigation, and Dr. Melinek raised another point worth understanding before those results ever become public. When a body decomposes, she explained, bacteria can actually produce small amounts of alcohol in the bloodstream after death. So if the toxicology report eventually shows a small trace of alcohol, that would not necessarily mean Nolan had been drinking before he died. It could just as easily mean bacteria produced it afterward, with no alcohol in his system at all at the time of death. Crump has said the family wants Dr. Mitchell to present his interpretation of that toxicology data directly to a grand jury, alongside the state's own experts, so that no single reading of the numbers goes unchallenged. Was Nolan intoxicated when he entered the water? Unknown. The results haven't been made public. Even once they are, will everyone agree on what they mean? Or will this become the next contested detail in a case that's already full of them? As the official investigation moved slowly, the internet moved fast. TMZ reported that law enforcement sources described a video showing what may be a young black man in swim trunks that investigators are examining as possibly the last footage of Nolan alive. It has not been officially confirmed to show him. Separately, a photo began circulating online, appearing to show Nolan at a late-night pool party on July 4th, hours after he was reportedly last seen around 3 p.m. If real and accurately timed, it would directly contradict the known timeline. Its authenticity has not been verified. And in that same video TMZ reported on, some viewers online claimed to hear a voice in the background asking whether he was dead. That interpretation has not been substantiated by anyone with access to the actual evidence. It's speculation, the kind that spreads fast precisely because the real investigation has moved so slowly. This is the part of the story where it matters most to slow down, not speed up. A video that may or may not show him. A photo that may or may not be real. A claim about background audio that nobody official has confirmed. None of it is nothing. None of it is proof either. By late July, two versions of this case existed side by side. The official version: this remains an active, unresolved investigation. Early comments about drowning and no foul play reflected an initial theory, not a final conclusion. The case will go before a grand jury once the state's autopsy and toxicology findings are complete. The family's version: the investigation moved too fast toward the easy explanation and too slow toward transparency. Basic questions: the phone, the absence of a single witness to a drowning in a crowd of 200, the conflicting accounts of whether Nolan meant to stay or leave, still haven't been answered. And since the first few days, the family says, communication from the sheriff's office essentially stopped. Neither of these is a fabrication of the other. One side has the physical remains and the full case file. The other doesn't. That imbalance is, in some ways, the real engine of this story. Not a hidden conspiracy, but an information gap between the people with the evidence and the people who loved him. What started as a family's private grief became something much larger, one step at a time. Friends and family searched the island themselves before anyone official arrived in force. Attorneys, Crump, later joined publicly by Reverend Al Sharpton, pushed for transparency and commissioned an independent investigation. That independent investigation produced Dr. Mitchell's autopsy, an attempt to answer questions the state process hadn't. Local authorities, the Jackson County Sheriff's Office, remained the lead agency throughout, though the family says direct contact from that office nearly disappeared after the first week. State authorities completed their own autopsy in early August. Its findings have not been made public. Officials have said the full case, once complete, will go before a grand jury, and national organizations got involved. NOC President Derek Johnson accused investigators of being derelict in their duty to properly follow up. The organization passed a resolution calling on law enforcement, including the U.S. Department of Justice, to get involved. As of now, there is no public confirmation that the Department of Justice has opened its own investigation. That's a request that's been made publicly, not a confirmed federal action. It's an important distinction in a case where distinctions like that have often gotten lost. Mississippi's Department of Public Safety Commissioner Sean Tindell pushed back publicly on the idea that the state's handling of the case reflected its past, saying on national television that Mississippi sees the world differently now than the people who once defined its history. And then, in early August, the case took a turn that had nothing to do with autopsies or discoloration or toxicology reports. Prosecutors announced that 3 people had been charged with making threats against a judge and against witnesses connected to the case. It's the most concrete legal action to come out of this entire investigation. Not a ruling on how Nolan died, an arrest over what someone allegedly tried to do to stop the process from reaching that ruling. Think about what that means. Somewhere, in the weeks since Nolan Wells' body was found, this case became serious enough, adversarial enough, that someone believed intimidating a judge, or the people willing to testify, could change what happens next. That doesn't tell us what happened on Horn Island. But it tells us the stakes of finding out have become very real to somebody. So, after all of it, what do we actually know? We know Nolan Wells went to Horn Island on July 4th. We know he was last seen there around 3 p.m. We know his friends left without him, and that 2 days later, his body was found in the water near the island. We know an independent autopsy found one physical finding, discoloration at the back of his head, significant enough that a credentialed pathologist wouldn't dismiss it, but not conclusive enough to call it trauma. We know that finding hasn't been explained, not as an injury, not as decomposition, just unexplained. We know witness accounts of whether Nolan planned to stay or leave still don't fully agree. We know the state completed its own autopsy weeks ago, and its findings have not been released. And we know no one, not the county, not the state, not the family's own expert, has been willing or able to say, officially, how Nolan Wells died. Somewhere in Ocean Springs, Mississippi, there's a mother who made her son salmon for dinner on a Friday night in July, hugged him, kissed him, and watched him walk out the door. She has been waiting ever since for someone to tell her, with certainty, what happened after that. The grand jury hasn't convened yet. The state's autopsy findings haven't been made public. The toxicology results are still pending. Until they are, everything about this case remains exactly what it's been since July 6th, a family with more questions than answers, and an investigation that owes them the truth, whatever it turns out to be.